The sound of the coffee cup crashing to the floor startled me. The impact echoed through the still kitchen, breaking the delicate tranquility of the moment. I stood there, paralyzed, my gaze fixed on Ethan, who faced me with a pained expression. I couldn't wrap my head around what was happening. "I can't pretend anymore," he murmured, his voice shaky and low, as if he were struggling to release the words before they choked him. My breath hitched in my throat. "What do you mean?" I asked, the words slipping out almost without thought, even though I wasn't sure I really wanted to know his answer. Ethan met my eyes, his blue gaze clouded with a strange intensity one hadn't seen before. It lacked the familiar warmth of a son returning home after a long absence, replaced instead by something darker and more profound. I couldn't shake the sense that whatever he was about to say would alter everything. He faltered, his hand instinctively moving to the back of his neck, a nervous habit from his childhood. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I can't act like things are normal between us anymore." His confession crashed over me like a tidal wave, sweeping away my composure and leaving confusion in its wake. I felt my hands tremble, so I gripped the counter behind me to steady myself. What was he talking about? What had shifted in our relationship? "Ethan, what's going on?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen walls felt suddenly oppressive, closing in around me. He exhaled deeply, as if he'd been carrying this burden for far too long. "I don't know how to put it, but things haven't felt right since I came back." I swallowed hard, striving to understand. My son had been away for nearly 2 years, first for school, then traveling through Europe, and now he was finally home. I had expected some awkwardness, perhaps even a bit of distance after all that time. People change, time changes things. But this felt entirely different. His words hung between us, heavy and unresolved. "Are you saying you don't want to be here?" I asked, hoping this conversation revolved around nothing more serious than him struggling to adapt to life back under my roof. That would be understandable, even expected, but deep down I sensed it was more complicated than that. "No," he shook his head, searching my eyes for understanding. "It's not that. It's that I can't stay here and pretend everything is the same when it's not." I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean? What's changed?" He stepped closer to me, and I instinctively wanted to retreat, but my feet stayed firmly planted on the ground. His presence felt overpowering in an unfamiliar way. Although he was still my son, he had grown taller and broader, and something about the way he carried himself now felt different. "Everything's changed," he said, his voice lower but still filled with intensity. You don't see it. But I do." A surge of panic coursed through me. I felt a cold sweat prickle my skin despite the warmth of the room. "Ethan, I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, struggling to regain control of the conversation, desperate to make sense of this. For a moment silence enveloped us. His expression softened, yet the tension in the air only grew thicker. He opened his mouth as if to say more, but no words came. Instead, he simply stood there, watching me with that same inscrutable intensity, as if he were waiting for me to acknowledge something I couldn't quite grasp. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching out into what felt like eternity. I longed to break the spell of this moment with words, but nothing came to mind. My thoughts swirled with confusion, fear, and an elusive feeling I couldn't name. Finally, I forced myself to move, bending down to collect the broken shards of the cup that had fallen earlier. My hands shook as I gathered the pieces, focusing on anything other than the suffocating silence hanging between us. As I stood up again, I noticed Ethan hadn't budged. He remained close, his gaze following my every movement. It was unsettling. I couldn't pinpoint why I felt this way, he was my son after all. But everything about this moment felt wrong. "Maybe you just need some time to adjust," I said, unsure of what I was even saying. "It's been a long time since you've been home. We'll get back to normal. It's just an adjustment period." Ethan's expression hardened slightly, frustration flashing in his eyes. "That's the thing," he replied, his voice sharper now, slicing through the tension like a knife. "I don't think we can go back to normal." I froze again. "What do you mean?" I repeated, even though a part of me didn't want to hear the answer. He let out a heavy sigh, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, as if he were battling something inside. "It's hard to explain," he muttered, his voice trembling. But when I look at you now, it feels different. I can't just pretend it isn't. My stomach sank. Ethan, what are you saying? His eyes flickered with something. Was it guilt? Regret? He hesitated, and the longer the silence stretched, the faster my heart raced. I had no idea what he was trying to communicate, but I sensed it was something I didn't want to hear. I'm saying, he paused, and when he finally spoke again, his voice dropped to a whisper. I'm saying I don't know how to stop feeling like this. It was then I understood. This wasn't merely about Ethan's discomfort at home. Something deeper had shifted between us, and as I stood there in the kitchen, I felt utterly lost on how to mend it. Following that peculiar moment, the air between Ethan and me turned tense, almost stifling. I couldn't shake the notion that something important remained unspoken, a lingering issue that needed resolution. I wished that with time, everything would simply fall back into place. But that didn't happen. Each day passed with the sensation that we were tiptoeing around an invisible line, one that neither of us dared to cross, yet both of us were acutely aware of. A few days later, Ethan proposed we take a short getaway to clear our heads. He suggested we visit the lake house, a place we hadn't returned to in years. It had once been our family's summer retreat, but after the divorce, I found it too painful to go back. The memories of happier times were too raw, and the house had become a relic of our past, left untouched. Maybe it'll do us good, he suggested. Let's get away from here. A change of scenery might help. I was taken aback by his suggestion. I hadn't expected him to want to revisit that spot. But I agreed, hoping that perhaps the fresh air and familiar landscape might help relieve the tension that had been building since he returned. Maybe being in close quarters at the house was what made things feel so strained. As we drove, silence enveloped us, the soft hum of the car engine filling the void where conversation should have thrived. I glanced over at Ethan now and then, attempting to interpret his expression, but his face remained unreadable, revealing nothing of his thoughts. His grip on the steering wheel was tight, suggesting he, too, was wrestling with unspoken feelings. The house by the lake looked just as it always had, though time had left its mark, dust coating the windows and wild grass overtaking the yard. Returning felt surreal. Walking up the familiar stone path we used to dash down during Ethan's childhood, vivid memories flooded back, yet they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. We unpacked in silence. Ethan claimed his old room upstairs while I took the master bedroom, just as we had for countless summers before. The house was cold. The air still held the musty scent of abandonment, but it was also a comfort. I hoped that being here would help ease the tension that had settled between us. That evening, we decided to stroll along the lake. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the water. The cool breeze was refreshing, and for the first time in days, I felt a bit more at ease. We started our walk in silence, but eventually, Ethan broke it. You know, I've been thinking a lot about our situation, he said softly, his gaze locked on the horizon. About us? I echoed, uncertain of where this conversation would lead. Yeah, he replied, nodding. About how things used to be before everything changed. A lump formed in my throat. I knew he meant the divorce, and how it had shattered our family. I had never been able to fully repair the damage, and Ethan had felt distant for years. Now that he was back, the cracks in our relationship seemed to be widening. It's been tough, I admitted quietly. But I thought we were managing. Ethan stopped and turned to me, his expression unreadable, but with an intensity in his eyes that made my heart race. I don't think we've actually dealt with it, he said softly. I think we've just been pretending. Pretending? I repeated, feeling a chill run down my spine. Yeah, he stepped closer. Acting like everything's fine when it's really not. I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my emotions in check. What are you trying to say, Ethan? For a moment he hesitated, standing there as if searching for the right words. Finally he spoke. I can't quite explain it, but it feels like something has shifted between us, and I don't know how to fix it. His words hung heavy in the air, laden with significance. I was at a loss for words. I had felt the change too, but I didn't want to confront it. Standing there by the lake, with the sun setting behind us, and an uncomfortable silence stretching between us, I could no longer ignore the truth. I don't know what you mean, I whispered, even though a part of me already grasped it. Ethan looked away, his jaw clenching. Maybe I'm just imagining things, he muttered, shaking his head. Perhaps I just need time to sort it all out. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, but something held me back. Instead, I nodded, feeling the weight in my chest. Maybe we both do, I said softly. We continued walking in silence, the burden of unspoken thoughts lingering between us. The lake, usually so serene and calming, now felt oppressive, as if the stillness mirrored the tension in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the brink of something monumental. The next morning, we fell into an uneasy routine. I made breakfast while Ethan sat on the porch, gazing out at the lake. Neither of us spoke much. The strain between us felt like a taut wire ready to snap. After breakfast, Ethan suggested we head into town for supplies. The old country road was peaceful as we drove, the radio playing softly in the background. I watched the trees blur past, trying to distract myself from the discomfort of our silence. Once in town, we pulled into the small general store we used to frequent when Ethan was little. It hadn't changed much. Shelves lined with local produce and the faint scent of fresh bread filling the air. As we wandered the aisles, I tried to initiate a casual conversation. Do you remember when we used to come here, and you'd always beg for ice cream? I asked, trying to inject some lightness into my tone. Ethan glanced my way and offered a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Yeah, I remember. You always gave in to me. I was such a pushover. I let out a soft laugh, though it felt forced. Ethan fell silent, and that moment passed as quickly as it had arrived. As we exited the store, Ethan's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, his brow furrowing. I need to take this, he said, stepping away from me to answer the call. I stood by the car, watching him from a distance. His expression was tense as he spoke in hushed tones, his back turned to me. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could sense that something was off. When he finally hung up and returned to my side, his face was unreadable. Everything okay? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Yeah, it's fine, he replied, but the clipped tone betrayed him. I knew he wasn't sharing the full truth. The drive back to the house felt even quieter than the trip there. I kept stealing glances at him, trying to gauge his mood, but his face remained expressionless. A growing sense of unease settled over me, as if I were waiting for something inevitable, but I had no idea what it might be. That evening, the tension finally reached a breaking point. We were sitting together on the porch, the soft glow of the setting sun shimmering off the lake. The silence had become unbearable, and I couldn't hold it in any longer. Ethan, what's going on? My voice trembled slightly as I spoke. You've been distant since we got here. Is something wrong? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he rose and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out at the water for what felt like an eternity. I wondered if he would remain silent. Finally, he turned to me. It's not that something's wrong, he said quietly. It's that I don't know how to talk to you anymore. His words struck me harder than I anticipated. What do you mean? I pressed. He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. I don't know how to be around you without feeling like I'm hiding something. My heart raced as I stood up, confusion flooding me. Ethan, what are you talking about? We've always been close. What could you possibly be holding back? He met my gaze, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. That's the thing, Mom. I don't think we've ever been as close as we pretend to be. My stomach twisted at his admission. What do you mean? I asked, needing clarification. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped closer. His eyes locked onto mine. For the first time I saw it. A deeper, more complicated issue than I had ever realized. Ever since I got back, he said, his voice low. I've been trying to understand why things feel so different, why I feel so different. And I think I finally know. I stood frozen, unable to move, my mind racing to comprehend his words. It's because... He hesitated, and in that moment I saw the conflict in his expression. It's because I'm not looking at you the way I used to. The world tilted and I fought to keep my balance. What are you saying, Ethan? I whispered, though deep down I sensed I already knew the answer. Then, to my shock, he closed the distance between us and kissed me. It was brief, a fleeting moment that shattered everything. I pulled away, my heart racing, breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "What are you doing?" I stammered, stepping back. My mind spun, unable to process the gravity of what had just occurred. Ethan's face reflected regret, but also something that terrified me. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean for that to happen." I stepped back again, my heart pounding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. "This isn't right, Ethan. You know it isn't." "I know," he replied, anguish coloring his tone. "But I don't know how to stop feeling like this." Tears threatened to spill from my eyes, and I quickly brushed them away, fighting to remain composed. "We need to go inside," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to stop this before it gets worse." Ethan nodded, pain etched on his face. "I'm sorry, Mom. I never wanted to hurt you." I didn't respond, I couldn't. My mind was consumed by the knowledge that everything had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. After that night, everything shifted. Ethan and I moved through the house like strangers, careful not to draw too close, avoiding each other's gazes. The tension loomed over us like an impenetrable fog. I spent most of the following day in the kitchen, pretending to occupy myself with trivial tasks, desperately trying to push away the thoughts of what had transpired. Ethan, on the other hand, spent the day outside working on something by the dock. I caught glimpses of him through the kitchen window, watching him move back and forth, his body tense and his movements deliberate. Every time I looked at him, a knot tightened in my stomach. The air inside felt heavy, charged with the weight of everything said and done the night before. By the time evening rolled around, I could no longer bear the silence. I needed to escape the suffocating atmosphere. "I'm heading into town for a bit," I called to Ethan from the doorway, grabbing my keys. I didn't wait for his response, and honestly I wasn't sure if I even wanted one. I just needed space. The drive into town was a blur. I wasn't sure where I was headed until I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a small bar at the edge of town. I hadn't been there in years, but it was the first place that popped into my mind when I thought about getting away. Inside, the atmosphere was dimly lit, with a few scattered patrons sitting at the bar or in small groups at the tables. I ordered a drink and settled into a far corner of the bar, hoping to blend into the background and escape for a little while. The weight of the last few days felt heavy on my shoulders, and I just needed a moment to breathe and think about anything but my current situation. Just as I began to relax, I sensed a presence beside me. I glanced up to find a man standing there with a slight smile. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment. I hadn't come here to socialize, but something about his demeanor was disarming, and maybe I needed a distraction. "Sure," I replied quietly, gesturing for him to take the seat across from me. He introduced himself as Lucas, a local who had lived here for years. We engaged in casual conversation about nothing in particular, and it felt surprisingly easy. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief, talking to someone who wasn't entangled in the weight of my reality back home. As the evening wore on, I found myself laughing at one of Lucas's jokes, and for a fleeting moment, the chaos waiting for me at home faded into the background. However, that moment was short-lived. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I looked at the screen, my heart sank at the sight of Ethan's name. "I should go," I said abruptly, standing up. Lucas looked taken aback but didn't question my sudden change of heart. "Thanks for the company," I added. He smiled, though I noticed a hint of disappointment in his eyes. "Maybe I'll see you around," he said warmly. I nodded, but I knew I wouldn't be returning. This was a temporary escape, and now I had to face reality again. The drive back home was suffocating. With each passing mile, the tension in my chest grew heavier. I parked the car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, summoning the courage to step inside. Finally, after taking a deep breath, I exited the car and approached the house. As I opened the door, I spotted Ethan sitting on the couch, illuminated by the dim light of the living room. He looked up as I walked in, his expression unreadable. For a moment we simply stared at each other, the weight of unspoken words filling the air between us. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice quiet yet tense. "I just needed some air," I replied, attempting to keep my voice steady. "I went into town for a bit." Ethan nodded slowly, but his eyes remained locked on mine. There was something in his gaze that sent my heart racing. an unresolved tension that felt dangerous. "You don't have to lie to me," he said, his tone soft yet pointed. "I'm not lying," I retorted, though even I questioned that statement. Maybe I wasn't lying about where I had been, but I was certainly hiding my feelings about everything else. The weight of it all felt overwhelming. Ethan stood up and moved closer to me. "You don't have to hide from me," he said softly. "Not anymore." I instinctively took a step back, my heart racing. "Ethan, we can't keep doing this," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to stop pretending that everything is okay. It's not. You know it's not." For a moment he was silent, and then before I could react he stepped closer, closing the distance between us. His hand brushed against mine, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I thought he was going to kiss me again. But instead he paused, his eyes searching mine. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered, his voice filled with raw intensity that made my breath hitch. "I don't know what to do with these feelings." Tears welled in my eyes as I took another step back. "We can't, Ethan," I whispered. "We can't keep going down this road. It's wrong." "I know," he replied, his voice breaking, "but I don't know how to stop." For what felt like an eternity we stood there, staring at each other, the weight of everything crashing down around us. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 conflicting thoughts. In that moment I understood there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would change everything. The following days blurred together. Ethan and I barely exchanged words, as if we both understood that naming anything would make it too real. I moved through the house like a ghost, doing my best to avoid him. Each time I caught a glimpse of him, my stomach twisted into knots. I had hoped that by keeping our distance, we might regain some semblance of control over the situation. But the silence only made everything feel worse. Ethan spent most of his time in his room, and when he wasn't there, he was by the dock, staring out at the lake. The weather had turned colder, a chill settling into the air that mirrored the tension inside the house. The once beautiful retreat felt like a prison, each day dragging on endlessly. I couldn't endure it any longer. I needed to break the silence and address the unspoken tension between us, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. One evening, after hours of sitting on the porch staring at the fading light over the water, I finally gathered the courage to go inside and confront him. I found Ethan in the living room, occupying the same spot on the couch where we had shared that life-altering conversation. He looked up as I entered, his face unreadable. Taking a deep breath, I felt my heart race. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaky but resolute. Ethan nodded silently but didn't speak. I crossed the room and settled into the armchair opposite him, trying to find the right words to break the heavy silence. The atmosphere between us was thick with unsaid emotions, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. "I've been doing some thinking." I began, my throat feeling tight. "About everything that's happened. About us." Ethan's expression darkened, and he shifted uncomfortably, yet he remained silent. "We can't keep this up," I continued, forcing myself to push through the discomfort. "I know you're struggling and I am too, but whatever this is, it's not healthy. It's not right." He averted his gaze, his jaw tense. "I know," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to make it stop." A chill ran through me at his admission. I swallowed hard, fighting to maintain my composure. "Ethan, you need to leave. We both need some space. Time apart might help us gain some clarity." For a moment he didn't respond. Finally he nodded slowly. "You might be right," he said, his voice sounding hollow. "But leaving won't change how I feel." A wave of sadness washed over me. "Ethan, you're confused. This isn't real. It's just emotions getting tangled up. It will pass, I promise you." He shook his head, anguish evident on his face. "I don't think it will," he whispered. "I've tried to push it away, but it's only become more intense." I stood up, feeling like I was suffocating. "This isn't fair," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not fair to either of us. I'm your mother, Ethan. We can't cross that line." He stood, his eyes fixed on mine with a desperate intensity. "But what if we already have?" His question hit me like a blow to the chest. I froze, wanting to deny it, to assert that he was wrong. But deep down I knew the truth. We had already crossed a line, and it had become increasingly blurred. Standing there in the dim light of the living room, I realized that we might never be able to return to the way things were. Tears welled in my eyes and I turned away, not wanting him to witness my vulnerability. "You need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please." There was a long silence, and then I heard Ethan take a deep breath. "Okay," he replied softly. "I'll go." I couldn't bring myself to turn around. It felt too painful. I stood there, staring out the window, listening to the sound of him gathering his belongings. The front door creaked as he opened it, and then without another word he was gone. I remained frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the house was deafening. My mind raced, replaying every single detail of what had transpired. Each word, each moment looping endlessly. How had it come to this? How had we allowed things to escalate so far? Just when I thought the worst was over, I heard footsteps approaching behind me. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be Ethan? No, that was impossible. He had left. He was gone. I turned slowly, and there stood Lucas in the doorway, the man I had met at the bar. My breath caught in my throat. "What are you doing here?" I stammered, my voice shaking. He smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I remembered. It was darker, almost predatory. "I told you I'd see you again," he said, stepping further into the room. Panic surged within me. "How did you?" "I followed you," he interrupted, his voice low and menacing. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." I backed away, my mind racing in a panic. This couldn't be happening. Not now, especially not after everything with Ethan. "I think it's time for us to settle some unfinished business," Lucas said, his tone dripping with intent. I swallowed hard, my heart racing. I wanted to scream, to flee, but my feet felt cemented to the floor. How had everything unraveled so completely? In that instant, everything I believed came crashing down. Lucas took another step forward. His eyes locked onto mine, and I realized with chilling clarity that this was only the beginning of whatever nightmare was unfolding.